Welcome to On the Middle East, the podcast of the award-winning media service El Monitor, where each week we talk with the decision makers and thought leaders who are making the news and shaping the trends in the Middle East. I'm Andrew Parasolidi, president of El Monitor, and this week our guest is Dimitri Simes, president and CEO of the Center for the National Interest and publisher of its foreign policy magazine, The National Interest. Dimitri is also one of the top American experts on Russia. He was selected to lead the center by former President Richard Nixon, to whom he served as an informal policy advisor and with whom he traveled to Russia and other former Soviet states, as well as Western and Central Europe. Mr. Simes was born in Moscow, where he graduated from Moscow State University and studied and worked at the Institute of the World Economy and International Relations. My conversation with Dimitri Simes about the Russian invasion of Ukraine and what it means for the Middle East begins now. Dimitri, welcome to On the Middle East. Pleased to have you join our podcast today to talk about Russia, Ukraine, and the Middle East.
Andrew, thank you for having me.
You know Russia as well as anyone. You've interacted with Putin. He seems undeterred by the financial and now energy sanctions on Russia. What is your expectation for his endgame in Ukraine, politically and militarily?
Well, I think a fundamental question is, what does it mean for Putin to be undeterred? We do not know what his original plans were, how far he intended to go. Today, he and his associates are saying that they're not planning to occupy the whole Ukrainian territory. They're saying that they would not attempt to conduct any elections or to put themselves in charge of Ukrainian governance. I do not know whether they would have such ambitions if the military campaign was going better. At this point, they clearly understand that something went very wrong. They did not expect this level of Western unity. They did not anticipate that that severity of Western sanctions. And probably most of all, they did not expect that the Ukrainian resistance, military resistance, would be so stiff. They were under the impression that most Ukrainians, according to public opinion polls, do not quite like President Zelensky. They thought that at least in eastern Ukraine, the Russians would be met as liberators, sometimes with flowers, in most cases, at least with some level of acceptance. And that clearly did not happen. The Russian military is still moving forward in Ukraine, but very, very slowly. They still don't have control over the air. And there was one fundamental miscalculation. Somehow they persuaded themselves the time was working in their favor. But the time is working against them. It is working against them because of a massive Western military assistance to the Ukrainian military, including thousands and thousands of anti-tank missiles, anti-aircraft missiles, a lot of other lethal weapons. And as the Ukrainian army is getting all these weapons, it is obviously becoming more capable to offer serious resistance to the Russian army. And on the Russian side, there are heavy losses and there are morale problems. So I do think that Putin is probably deterred from doing some of the most ambitious things he was contemplating, like full control of the whole Ukraine. But at the same time, I think it would be very damaging to him politically, including in Russia, if he now decided to retreat. He would need some kind of solution which would allow him to claim victory, or at least an appearance of victory. And so far, he did not hear anything from the West, or for that matter, from the Zelensky government, that would allow Putin to say, well, we did what we needed to do, or we got what was required, and now we can go home. He clearly is not at that point yet.
The diplomatic track to end the conflict pretty much seems relegated to others, at least from a Washington perspective, because the Biden administration has not been directly involved, or at least according to the reports we're seeing. So the gap has been filled mostly by French President Macron, but also by Israeli Prime Minister Bennett and Turkish President Erdogan, as the Turkish foreign minister hosted a meeting of his Russian and Ukrainian counterparts today. How does Putin see these diplomatic initiatives by others and the absence of direct diplomacy from Washington? Do you think these initiatives have much of a chance? And if so, what would be the bottom line or the nature of a deal if there was to be one to put together at this point?
Well, let's start with President Macron. President Macron tried to position himself as almost a friend of Putin, as a person who was somewhat independent from the United States in terms of his approaches to Russia, and that he was indicating to Putin that he would be willing to take Russian interests into account, including Russian desire not to allow NATO to move further east. But as France joined the United States in very severe sanctions, as the French Minister of Finance is talking about an economic war against Russia, as France is arresting Russian ships, which are not even in French territorial waters, you have to assume that Macron does not have great credibility with Putin. It certainly is not viewed as a particular friend of Russia. The question in Moscow is to what extent he is also talking for the United States. And they believe that it is the United States that is the main actor in this conflict, at least on the Western side. And it is only the United States that can really tell President Zelensky what to do. So Putin is talking to Macron. I know that some of his advisors were saying that he should not even be taking Macron's phone calls when France is trying to punish Russia so severely. But Putin is very practical in situations like that. He is a very proud man, but he doesn't like to show that he is offended, that he is emotional about something. But I do repeat, Macron's credibility with Putin is limited, both in terms of Macron having positive feelings toward Russia and in terms of Macron having a real influence over President Zelensky. As far as Erdogan is concerned, clearly Turkey is very important to Russia in many other respects. At the same time, Turkey is not quite Russia's friend. They have very tense relationship in Syria, very difficult situation in Libya, where Russia and Turkey are on different sides. And obviously Russia does not appreciate that Turkey is supplying Ukraine with offensive weapons, including rather effective Turkish military drones. And then Prime Minister Bennett, Bennett clearly is an important player because there is a perception in Moscow that they were trying to provide Israel with a relatively free hand in Syria, in the whole region, that they were sensitive to Israeli concerns over Iranian nuclear program. And they hoped that Israel, as it became Israeli practice recently, would not join the United States in any denunciations of Russia, and particularly any sanctions against Russia. But Bennett decided under pressure from the United States, European Union, really to take sides in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. And it is on the side of Kiev, not on the side of Moscow. He may be an interesting interlocutor. I'm sure that Putin would be interested to get Bennett's evaluation of the situation, but I don't see any particular leverage Bennett having on Putin. And Putin assumes that there are a lot of people, Jews who left Russia, now live in Israel, but still have sentimental feelings about Russia. And they kind of assume that for his domestic reasons, Israel probably would not want to be too harsh on Russia. So all these interlocutors are interesting. They can talk to Russia. They can try to find some common approaches, but they all have limited influence. They have a limited influence in Moscow. They have a limited influence in Washington, and they don't have great influence in Kiev.
Dimitri, these sanctions we're talking about seem devastating to Putin. You mentioned his miscalculation about the extent of the sanctions that has hit Russia since he invaded Ukraine. They are also hitting the oligarchs who have supported Putin in the past, and of course the Russian people. Can Putin himself survive the sanctions, and what are the prospects for regime change in Russia? Is there a constituency in the military among the oligarchs through mass protests that could push him aside? And more broadly, what are some of the scenarios if something like this started to happen for destabilization in Russia?
Well, let's deal with some facts first. Putin's popularity as a result of the war in Ukraine went up rather than down. And that's not because of great Russian military successes, because so far those military successes were few and far between. But the problem is different. Even people who question Putin's decision to invade Ukraine question for both moral and practical reasons. These people, when they're confronted with crippling sanctions, as many politicians in Washington say, sanctions from hell, sanctions which do not make a real distinction between Russian officials, Putin's supporters, and ordinary Russians, surprise, surprise, they begin to feel very patriotic. And Putin is becoming the symbol of Russia standing up tall against the whole collective West. Now, that is as far as the situation looks today. But clearly, as the sanctions really start doing damage, if people do not get their salaries, everybody is still getting their salary in Russia. If pensions are no longer paid, or at least are not delivered on time, if people discover that a couple of Russian planes have crashes because they don't have reliable spare parts, I think that people may start feeling differently. And it's very difficult for Putin to retreat under the current circumstances because he made his whole career by looking like a symbol of Russian greatness, like a strong man who knew how to confront anyone and was afraid of nothing. So if he would be greatly diminished in stature, I think it would make him vulnerable. But it would make him even more vulnerable if the whole economy would begin to disintegrate. Putin's principal constituency are not liberal intellectuals, not high-tech people, are not successful investors, These are so-called budgetniki, people who get their money from the state budget, retired people, millions and millions of people working for the government, people who work in state-controlled companies. This was Putin's most reliable constituency so far. But these are also the people who are least protected to deal with economic hardships, which may be caused by a collapsing economy. So I would say that Putin today is more popular and looks almost stronger than ever, but his support is wide, but also thin. You can see that not too many Russian soldiers are enthusiastic about dying for Putin in Ukraine. So if I would be Putin, I would be thinking very seriously about how to find a solution from the situation he found himself in Ukraine, but to find a solution which would not create an impression that he was defeated or diminished.
Dimitri, how concerned are you about miscalculation and escalation? We're talking here about Russia. It has, I think, the world's largest nuclear arsenal. Russia also has a formidable cyber capability. Of course, the US and NATO have been very careful to draw their own red lines. You saw that the US nixed sending planes to Polish planes to Ukraine. How worried are you that things could escalate?
Andrew, I'm quite worried. And I am worried about miscalculations and misperceptions on both sides. We already talked about Putin's miscalculations, but look at Western miscalculations. For decades, Russian specialists, experienced diplomats, senior officials were predicting that NATO expansion to the east, particularly attempts to bring Ukraine into NATO, would not only encounter stiff Russian resistance, but could affect Russian fundamental attitude to the West. George Kennan was talking about that back in the 90s, and he was very concerned that, that NATO expansion could put Russia on the wrong course and affect not only more anti-Western policy, but also would give more power to the military security services and make Russia less democratic and more anti-Western. A person who always was considered a hawk, Robert Gates, who was CIA director, Secretary of Defense under both Republicans and Democrats, was talking about NATO overreaching and the danger of bringing NATO literally to the suburbs of St. Petersburg. And all of these warnings were totally ignored. Whenever Russia would express concern, the conventional wisdom in Washington would say, oh, come on, they cannot be serious. NATO is strictly a defensive alliance. How a small country like, let's say, Estonia, be a threat to Russia? And the answer was at first, no, NATO is not strictly a defensive alliance. Just ask the Serbs, just ask the Iraqis, just ask the Libyans. NATO was involved in many offensive operations, either as an alliance as a whole, as in the case of Serbia, or leading NATO members like the United States, Britain and France during certain expeditions in the Middle East. So in the Russian view, NATO is not an offensive alliance. Reasonable people may disagree about that, but they should not reject the obvious. Russia does not believe that NATO is an offensive alliance. Now, and how Russia could view seriously as a threat its small neighbors? Well, the answer is that from the very beginning, when there was an expectation of NATO enlargement, there were two schools of thought. in terms of how this enlargement would affect the basic character of the alliance. And the Russians were saying these small and sometimes, like in the case of Poland, not so small countries, they have a lot of grievances against Russia. They want to be in the alliance because they're afraid of Russia. And moreover, they have animosity toward Russia. And if they would be protected by NATO Article 5, they would want to use NATO Article 5, nuclear umbrella, to protect themselves against Russian retaliation and to have a more assertive policy vis-a-vis Russia. And the Russians were saying that because these East European countries feel stronger about Russia than traditional Europeans, that the small countries, as they become more and more integrated into the alliance, they would become more and more influential in shaping alliance's policy toward Russia, which would be increasingly hostile. The alternative school of thought, the one articulated by Washington and Brussels, was that the opposite was true, that bringing these former Soviet satellites into NATO would give them greater sense of security, more self-confidence, and they would become, if you wish, a bridge between Russia and Western and Central Europe. Well, it's very clear that the Russian point of view, the Russian expectation that East Europeans would try to push Russia in a more hostile direction vis-a-vis Moscow, that school that was proven to be right. So for Russia, bringing Ukraine into NATO is considered an existential issue. I'm sure, aware of Zbigniew Brzezinski evolution on this issue. He, for many years, of course, dreamed of independent Poland. He felt very strongly that Ukraine should be independent from Russia. And he was saying that if Ukraine would be truly independent from Russia, Russia could not become again an empire. But particularly in his last years, Brzezinski began speaking, I would say, quite powerfully against bringing Ukraine into NATO, saying that this was a bridge too far, that because Russia viewed Ukraine and NATO as an existential threat, you could not have European stability. And if you wish, you could not have European and Ukrainian security if Ukraine would be determined to get into NATO, and if NATO would create an impression that Ukraine is going to be in NATO. And these warnings were, in my view, quite clear and quite persuasive. But they all were ignored. And I have a very simple question. In what respect NATO today can feel triumphant looking at what is happening in Ukraine and around Ukraine? Surely, Russia is suffering. Surely, Russia is being punished. Surely, Putin was put in a very difficult position. But don't we care about what is happening to Ukraine? Aren't we bothered that by trying to give Ukraine an opportunity to enter NATO, that nobody was actually inviting Ukraine into NATO, we have contributed to a situation when Ukraine is really in a catastrophic situation and being bloodied and tortured. And now we can say that this is all Putin's responsibility. But Putin's responsibility does not mean that we are entitled not to care about making sound decisions ourselves. And in terms of escalation, this is an existential challenge to Russia as far as the Russians are concerned. And I think that Putin was very clear about his red lines. He has military tools to deal with escalation, and even to have escalation dominance in some respects in Eastern Europe. Putin cannot sustain a long war against the whole of Western alliance. But if it is a kind of a short-term situation, he can do a lot of things. And I would not want to compete with Putin in terms of ruthlessness and readiness to do whatever to prevail. I think it's a dangerous situation, and that's why I think it is very much in our interest to look for a genuine diplomatic solution, and not just to sit and hope that we will bloody and punish Putin, and hopefully he will be removed. If he would not be removed, Russia would be greatly damaged. I think that trying to greatly damage a nuclear power and the country of Russian size and Russian pride, I think it's a kind of a reckless approach, and I hope we will get to a serious diplomatic business without too much delay.
Dimitri, let's talk about Syria for just a minute. And I want to ask the question two ways. First, how did the Russian military experience in Syria influence Russia in terms of its campaign in Ukraine, if it did? And secondly, what changes do you expect, if any, regarding Russia's policy in Syria?
I think that the Russians basically feel that they were successful in Syria, and certainly was not an unqualified success. And they had to coexist with American forces in Syria. They certainly have a difficult relationship and have to control themselves in the very complex relationship with Turkey. And in the case of Israel, so far they were treating Israel and Syria with kid gloves, and were allowing the Israelis a great freedom of operation. I think that Russian, what I would call limited successes in Syria, perhaps gave them an excessive self-confidence and an unjustified feeling that they would be able to prevail in Ukraine with, if you wish, limited damage to their military power and to their treasure. A lot depends upon how that conflict in Ukraine ends for Putin. If Putin is able to get peace with honor and end the situation with recognized control of Crimea, with an enlarged territory of Donetsk and Lugansk, so-called republics, where they would go, and they're already very close to getting to administrative borders of Donetsk and Lugansk provinces. And if Ukraine would kind of make a commitment not to try to reverse this situation militarily, and if Ukraine would make some kind of meaningful commitment not to get into NATO anytime soon, and if this commitment would be confirmed by the alliance, I think many people in Russia, both ordinary people and the elite, they would have a sense of relief. But that's only true if, in addition to this limited arrangement in Ukraine, there would be a reversal of sanctions, which are hitting Russia very, very hard. And in the past, Russian diplomacy, I think they were quite unique in refusing to raise sanctions against them whenever they were negotiating with the West. I talked about that to Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and asked him why, in contrast with, let's say, the Iranians or the Koreans why wouldn't you raise the sanctions issue? It's an important issue for you. And he said to me, well, it's almost offensive to us to be put in the same category as Iran and North Korea. We are a great power. We also consider ourselves a democracy. We do not believe that the sanctions against us are legitimate. We had nothing to do with introducing the sanctions. We don't believe that we have done anything that would justify the sanctions. The sanctions are in nobody's interest, and the West should come back to its senses and just start removing sanctions on its own. Well, you know, it never happened. And the question is, would Putin continue this tradition of not demanding sanction relief, hoping against hope that the sanctions gradually would disappear somewhere, somehow, or would he insist on the sanction removal? And his ability to insist on the sanction removal, to a large extent, as far as I'm concerned, is going to depend upon situation on the battlefield. If it will look like Russians are victorious and are about to reach Ukrainian borders, I'm sure that there would be a strong sense in Europe that we need to put an end to it as quickly as possible, that no price is too high as long as the Ukrainian basic independence is preserved. But obviously, so far, such a success was eluding Russia.
Dimitri, many of us thought just last week that the Iran nuclear agreement was pretty much a done deal. And then Russia on last Saturday, insisted on a carve-out. What happens next? We saw that the Iranian negotiator returned to Vienna, and Iran has seemed to take a tougher line in what's supposed to be the final hours of the Vienna talks. Help us understand Russia's position in the context of its relationship with Iran, and is Russia ready to blow up the JCPOA negotiations?
Well, first of all, getting sanctions relief for Russia itself is certainly a greater priority for Moscow than going back to the Iranian nuclear deal. And you are absolutely right that the Russian position, Russian demand that they would get full benefits of this new arrangement, which they were promised together with others before the Ukrainian war. I think that the Russian position certainly emboldens the Iranian government. Having said that, however, Russia may demand whatever it wants, but if Iran would decide to go along, it would be very difficult for Russia to say no. And if it attempts to say no, it would only demonstrate Russian isolation and, if you wish, irrelevance, not only vis-a-vis the West, but even in the case of countries like Iran. I think the principal driving force in this situation is Tehran, not Moscow.
Dimitri, last question. We haven't talked about China. What does Russia expect from China at this point? And how has the Western response to Russia given China pause in terms of maybe its ambitions in Taiwan, and also maybe regarding its partnership with Russia?
Well, I think one reason the United States has an important interest in getting a diplomatic solution, because only a diplomatic solution would preclude Russia becoming Chinese junior partner. More and more people in the Russian national security establishment understand the limits of Chinese commitment to Russia. They can see today that China would not even vote with Russia at the UN Security Council General Assembly when resolutions denouncing Russia would be offered, resolutions in connection with Ukraine. The best China would do for Russia is to be neutral. And that's obviously a kind of in contrast with Western unity in demanding to denounce and to penalize Russia. We do get reports that Chinese banks are kind of hesitant to become full partners of Russian banks and to offer them a helping hand when they are under sanctions, because they don't want to be subjected to American secondary sanctions. It was just announced in Moscow that China has refused to supply Russia with spare parts for Western planes flying in Russia. And of course, these planes are under sanctions, and Russia is not supposed to get any spare parts in service. And there was a hope in Moscow that the Chinese here would offer a helping hand. That did not happen. But at the same time, China views Russia as an important strategic asset. Statements in Washington that the United States is not just challenging China and Russia because they are kind of hostile to American global interests, but also because it's American mission to challenge authoritarian regimes, to give it an ideological dimension. That pushes China and Russia closer together. And the Russians had a hope that their affiliation with China would be, on one hand, very strong and very substantive, but on the other hand, that it would be done with full respect for Russian interests and dignity. If Russia is indeed defeated in Ukraine, it may become beyond concerns over dignity or even less than central interests for Putin. And if China could almost automatically rely on Russian support against the United States and more generally against the collective West, I don't think it would be good for U.S. interests or for international stability.
Dimitri, this has been great. Thank you for joining us today on the Middle East. Really enjoyed this conversation with you.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed talking to you.
We will return after this short break.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Hagedorn, and I'm the State Department correspondent at Al Monitor.
And I'm Joe Snell. I'm Al Monitor's video editor. Let's admit it, this past year has been difficult to stay on top of the news and sift through what's accurate and what's misleading. Let Al Monitor help you.
If you like this podcast and care about the Middle East and North Africa, you should consider listening to Al Monitor's other audio series, On the Middle East with Andrew Parasalidi and Amberin Zaman, and On Israel with Ben Caspi. You can subscribe to these series on your favorite podcast platforms.
And through a host of free daily and weekly newsletters, we offer a range of perspectives with the highest journalistic standards. You can subscribe to these newsletters at almonitor.com.
As an award-winning media service headquartered in Washington, D.C., Al Monitor has a network of over 160 contributors around the world.
So if you haven't done so already, be sure to visit almonitor.com, where you can find all of these newsletters and podcasts along with first-class reporting and analysis.
Thanks to our guest, Dimitri Simes, and our production team of Beowulf Rockland and Rosabelle Hine of Two Square Media Productions. We will be back next week, and if you haven't done so, please sign up for all 3 of our podcasts at your favorite podcast platform. First, Reading the Middle East with Gilles Capel, whose guest this month is Nobel Peace Prize winner Maria Ressa, CEO of Rappler, the digital media website. And On Israel with Ben Caspit, where Ben this week speaks with Israel's most prominent high-tech entrepreneur, former Knesset member Errol Margalit, about Israel's response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And of course, this podcast On the Middle East, where I will be here next week with another decision maker or thought leader from the region. Thank you all for listening, and please keep up with all of the news and trends in the Middle East at lmonitor.com.